Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Death Checks with Misty Lynn and my wonderful co-host, Patty Burgess. We are interviewing Rachel Zeldin today, and Rachel's wonderful. We're so happy to have her back. A little bit more about the Death Checks, if this is your first time with us. We are here to simply talk about death, dying, grief, and loss. It's something as a society, as a culture, in our families, for some reason, people have a closed mouth about it if they feel uncomfortable, and it's time to start talking about it. We all do it. As Patty says, no one's getting out of here alive, so let's talk about it. Let's be frank about it. We bring some humor into it. We know loss is not funny. Loss hurts. It's painful, and on other shows we explore that. On today's show, we're going to be explaining the funeral industry. So thank you for joining us. Please share our show with your friends. Start talking about it. Let's change the world. Let's be ready for death so we can all go out feeling great and celebrating the life that we've lived. One more thing I would like to add is that we are branching out. We're expanding, and thank you very much to Rain Dowell, who introduced us to an app that's called Crowdcast. With Crowdcast, we can now have viewers from Facebook and from Twitter on your mobile. So if you have a Facebook or Twitter account, you can go ahead and use the Crowdcast link and log in and listen to us while you're driving on your iPhone or on your Android. So this is really cool, and we're happy to be getting out there in a bigger way. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Patty. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
All right, Misty. Thanks so much. Here we are. I am so excited that we've got Rachel back. And, you know, if you were here last time when Rachel was on, it's so interesting to me because if people aren't talking about death, they're not talking about funerals. They're really not talking about funerals. I mean, for some people that would be like watching grass grow or something, but I can tell you we were riveted last time with Rachel here telling us about all the kinds of things that we need to know, that we don't know, that we kind of take for granted in this whole funeral industry. And what I love about Rachel is that she does, as we said in the introduction, she brings a kind of transparency to this industry. And even if it was kind of self-shrouded by the industry themselves, she's kind of pulling back the curtain, but at the same time doing a really great job of supporting those funeral professionals who really want to get this kind of information out there. And the way she's doing it is through her site, I'm Sorry to Hear. What a great name. It's I'mSorryToHear.com. We have Rachel back. We've been calling her the rock star of funerals, or I guess fun in funerals. And I'm amazed, Rachel, because for a young lady, you know, not like a young girl, but a young lady, to have the kind of interest and passion that you do about this subject, I just kind of want to start us off by asking you, how did it get started for those people who don't know you or hadn't seen you before? Why funerals for a young girl? Tell us.
Why funerals? Hi, both of you. Hello, everyone. First off, I'm thrilled to be back. I felt like last time, I was almost on my deathbed last time. I was so sick, but like,
Kind of appropriate for our show.
You guys couldn't tell, but I was not feeling well at all, and I was trying to keep my energy up, and it seemed pretty toned down. Now you're in for it today, because I'm feeling 100%, so I might be oozing energy today. But I'm happy to be back.
My hair's going to blow back.
I could put my fan in this direction, and it can blow it. But I could talk about this for hours because there is just so much to talk about. I always associate death and funerals together, but Patty, you just separated the two in this intro. You're like, oh, let's talk about death, but no one talks about funerals. And I'm like, they go hand in hand.
You would think, but you know, people don't even talk about the dying process or the emotional, spiritual, physical part, let alone, to me, it's blinders on when it comes to funerals because we're just taking bodies over there and then somehow they do a thing and then that's it. That's all we know. What is that thing? So that's why you're here.
So I guess I approach this from a very practical standpoint. I don't get a lot of philosophy and emotion involved in this, and that's how I actually got into this to start with. So for those that don't know my background, I'll give you like a 30-second nutshell. I used to work in finance, sexy world of finance. And I happened to move into the sexier world of funerals simply out of my family's own experience in planning a funeral a few years back. And it wasn't a particularly horrible experience. It's not like the funeral home totally ripped us off or like completely failed to meet our expectations. It wasn't like that at all. It was more about the process of accessing information and being able to educate ourselves on what are our options, who can we use, what are we buying, how much it costs, kind of setting those expectations on our own before we got involved in the planning process.
Right, right.
And it didn't seem like a huge deal to have because, you know, when we want to go on vacation, there's lots of websites that help us navigate where to go, where to stay, how to get around, what to do there. When we want to buy a car or a house, there's lots of websites that help us tell us what is in our marketplace and what are the expectations in terms of buying one of those.
Right.
And so for me, I approach this from a very practical standpoint is like, well, when I want to plan a funeral, what tools and resources are there to help me navigate this event? And there just wasn't anything. And that's why I decided as, you know, Rachel the consumer, I want a better way to plan a funeral going forward. I want my neighbors and friends and extended family and community to be able to do this from the comfort of their own home so that we can be, I mean, we're never going to be as knowledgeable as the industry themselves, but we should at least know what we're getting ourselves into. We should be able to have an educated conversation when we arrive at their door, and hopefully that leads us to make better decisions for ourselves, whether that means spending less or that makes making different decisions altogether because we didn't even know that we had those options. So that's how I got into this.
Sure, and given what you said is that you approach it really from kind of a non-emotional standpoint, and that's terrific, and you need somebody like that, kind of how you would want an advocate to walk you through. But the way that people most often show up at funerals is only a couple of days out from the death that can be very emotional, and the next thing you know, there they are. And I never understood that personally. We waited a couple of months for a memorial service for my mother. I never understood, other than maybe some religious reasons, to have that body cared for in a tradition that matters to that family. Why the rush right then? That may be another question to ask you.
Yeah.
But so what you do is so important that it does offer this objectivity that is not often there when people are going to pay for funeral services.
Yeah, and today it's not just about like, is it burial or cremation? You know, those are kind of the tips of the iceberg. Once you choose one of them, there's a plethora of decisions that happen afterwards, which directly affect the cost of the funeral. And a lot of people don't recognize that. You know, they don't recognize that if we choose this, then we need this and that, and therefore the cost is going to be 2 to 3 times more than what we had planned, or you know, not even that we planned, because sometimes people don't even plan anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and that brings. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Were you going to the same?
Sure, I might have been. We have this great option with the Crowdcast app to answer questions, and it will timestamp it for us. So you mentioned some of the alternatives for burials and funerals, and I was wondering if you could talk about that before we talk about expenses.
Sure. So when we're talking about planning a funeral, the first thing that comes to most people's mind is, okay, well, I want to be cremated or I want to be buried, which are definitely decisions that you have to make, which are, you know, personal for yourself. But then on top of that, you have other options, such as, you know, what is important to you? I want something that is low cost, or I want something that's extravagant, because depending on that preference, that can affect how you get cremated and the services involved, or what type of burial that you have. So for example, if we're talking about cremation, you just might prefer to be cremated because you don't like taking up space in the ground. You think it's a waste. Just an example. You know, so you say, well, it's not really about cost for me. I still want to have a viewing. I still want to have a service, and then I want to be cremated, and I want a gorgeous urn, or I want to be shot into space. You know, so that is not a low-cost cremation option. You are not getting out of there without spending several $1,000s. On the other hand, if you say, I want cremation because it's not expensive, that's totally different. Now you're saying, okay, in this case, if I want to be cremated and not spend a lot, I want to find someone that's going to have, number one, a base price for cremation that is lower, because it varies from provider to provider. And then number two, I'm not going to have a viewing. I'm not going to have a casket. I'm not going to have a service at the funeral home, because those are all costs. And so maybe perhaps like what you did with your mother, I just want cremation. I just want to be cremated, and then at a later date, my family can have a memorial service in my honor at home, at the park, on top of a mountain, on a boat, wherever. And that is a far less costly option if that's what you're angling for, right? And then actually, if we want to add another layer of complexity on cremation, we could talk about green cremation.
Green cremation? I thought it was green burial. I had not even heard of green cremation.
So let's first talk about cremation and how green it really is.
Not like a green dye they put in or something?
No.
Teasing.
Totally not. So here's a myth. Let's dispel this myth to begin with. Some people choose cremation because they think it's the greener option compared to burial, because typically you're not embalmed, and then you're not taking up earth space with a casket, which took resources to make, and a vault, which also is encompassing the ground. So you're using less resources. So people think it's a greener option sometimes than burial. But let's just put it out there. It's not green. Like, the amount of energy that it takes to cremate a body is enormous. The CO2 that it gives off into our atmosphere is huge, let alone any other components that are part of our body that are given off in terms of like the evaporation. Mm-hmm. Right? Like you hear notoriously the mercury in our fillings, that goes back up into the air. So if you're choosing cremation because it's green, it's not.
Well, there you have it.
Okay.
All of those myths dispelled right here, but I sense we're going to be told that there are some options here for green.
Oh, you're so good. So this option is not available everywhere, and in fact, it's only starting to be available in very select states that have approved it as a form of disposition. They're dubbing it green cremation or water-based cremation as opposed to flame-based cremation. Okay?
Wait, it's so interesting. Just an interjection here, and this is going to sound as weird and wacky as it gets, but when you say water-based cremation, do you realize that the funeral home, when they handed me this, my mother's ashes, they said to me, and I think there was something written that I had to sign that basically said, I understood that I could not add water to reconstitute.
You're kidding me.
What?
What? No, you're not.
I have to go back and look. It was like, we laughed because I actually got to be friendly with the funeral director, but it was sort of like there are some people, you look at fine print on everything and contracts, and you know that it's in there because somebody at one time asked. So there was no reconstitution.
Do not add water. It will not grow into a human.
I couldn't believe it. But anyway.
Absurd. That's just absurd. And that's not at all what I was getting to. But that is hilarious. I wanted to talk about this water-based cremation or the green cremation. They're kind of finding their own marketing niche for how to tout this. The formal name is alkaline hydrolysis. And it's a process where there's a chamber involved that the body is placed in, and then it's filled up with a portion of water and another solution that is based on the alkaline hydrolysis, which is a chemical, and it helps rapidly accelerate. And then it's like actually put into like really high pressure situation, and between like the liquid mixture and the pressure, it rapidly accelerates the decomposition process. So basically, all that's left is liquid and bones. That's it. And at the end of that, there's this highly nutritious and 100% sanitary solution that is left, which can, I guess, in theory, go down the drains. I'm not 100% sure what they do with it. I don't know if they want us to know yet. And then there's bones. And so, like, literally, you could see, like, all the bones are left. There's a really cool video out there on this. And then what they they take those bones, and just much like after a flame-based cremation, there are still bone fragments. They put it into a resonator, or I think that's the official term.
Cremator? Creminator or something like that?
Right. It basically grinds it up into a finer powder and gives it some more consistency so it's not a lumpy solution. But anyway, in the end, the results are similar to what you get with a flame-based cremation, where there are ashes left, but it happens to be more of them, and it tends to be white rather than kind of a grayish mixture. But it's really cool because in terms of the energy that it uses, is far, far, far better for the environment, and the byproduct is actually supposedly good for the environment, although I'm sure they're going to do extensive tests on that. But it's an alternative to cremation as we know it today, but it's only approved as a form of disposition in certain states, and of course the machines that do it are not readily available yet everywhere. So it's a cool thing that we should all think about it, and if it's like an appealing form, I think that it's up to us to say, hey, state, we want this to be approved here, because it won't be approved overnight if there's not requests from outside.
Sure, sure. And this has come about as a result of the people asking for more green and recognizing that traditional cremation is not, or has this come about because we're losing space for burial, do you know, or just evolution of the industry?
I think it's kind of evolution and technologies in the industry. I think that one of the very first organizations that used it was the Mayo Clinic, and they are a huge research institution, so they get a lot of whole body donations, and after you donate your body, you are ultimately cremated in the end. I think unless you expressly state that's not what you want and then have the remaining parts kind of buried. But typically you donate your whole body, and when they're done doing their research or learning on you, if it's going to a medical school, then they would cremate the remains and return it to the family or put it into a special place that they have marked for all their donors. And so the Mayo Clinic does tons and tons and tons of these, and I think that one of the things they were looking at is there a greener way or less environmentally invasive way for us to take care of this. And so they were one of the first ones to implement it for human use, although it has been widely used on animals in the U.S. as well as abroad for a number of years.
Very neat, very neat.
Yeah. I'm really curious. I saw this great image. It was flying around Facebook or Google+, and it was a pod, and it was a very nice. It was done in Italy. It was this beautiful pod, and there was a tree growing out of it, and it was called a burial pod, and I thought, how lovely is that? Could you speak about that?
It's so poetic, the capsula mundi, as they call it.
Yes,
if you're it is beautiful. The imagery is beautiful. Now, of course, if you're looking for the actual product, it doesn't exist. It was a hypothetical. So those were simply illustrations of what it could look like, not actually what they're doing. So that's first things. And what's really cool about these burial pods, as I like to call them, is that they got like millions and millions of shares across the internet. I mean, I can't even tell you how many people in my feed, like on Facebook, were posting it. And then, of course, because I'm like, the funeral girl, everyone forwards me these things and is like, hey, I thought you would like to see this. And it's like, well, I've only seen this 10,000 times this week. But what I took from this is that, first, the people's reaction to this was, how cool, a green way to go. That was the overriding sentiment, right? Did you guys get the same thing?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to turn into a tree. I want to feed a tree. That works for me.
Sure.
You'd be a tree. If you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be?
Yeah, and so I think that was, there's something poetic about it, becoming a tree. And there's also something very eco-friendly about that. And I think all of, our generations are really starting to, want to have a death that's much like our life, which is like we like to recycle and we like to compost and we like to drive hybrid vehicles. So why would we want to then go pollute the environment with all of these other things when we can just become a tree and be part of the environment? So, but what people don't realize is that you can already become a tree. You could become wildflowers. You could become prairie grass. All you have to do is be put into a green burial ground.
Wow.
Right.
So where are they, and
Or
know more about them?
Okay, so green burial has existed for hundreds of years. And in fact, in the Jewish and Muslim culture, we don't call it green burial, we just call it burial.
That's true.
Right? So what that means when you choose a green burial is that you are opting not to get embalmed. You are opting to, if you're having a casket, you're having it of like very organic materials such as a plain pine box or made of wicker or banana leaves or something of that organic nature. Or you're opting just for like a burial shroud. And then instead of being placed in this box in the ground in another box called the outer burial container, you are literally just being placed in the ground and being covered with soil, and you go straight back in the ground.
Well, so, Rachel, it's interesting you say that because it seems like there's all these laws about where you can even drop ashes, but yet you can go, yeah, I know, like, so from what I know, like many of the people, myself included, you kind of go along and, you know, sprinkle as you go, and hopefully nobody's watching, but how can you just be put in the ground? Sorry, my mom and dad are going to be sprinkled together in the ground, probably surreptitiously, but how can you just be put in the ground? Are there just certain areas that this can happen and they've been designated that?
Yeah, exactly. So historically, like burial grounds that are naturally green are sometimes like Quaker burial grounds or burial grounds like cemeteries that are owned and run by a religious organization where they don't have all these commercial cemetery rules. So like the vault or liner, which are also called the outer burial container, is just a block of concrete that's basically put in the ground to go around the casket that helps the ground stay level so that as the casket deteriorates, the ground doesn't cave in. And it makes it easier for commercial, especially large commercial cemeteries, to maintain the lawn.
Okay.
Whereas like in smaller religious-based cemeteries or Quaker cemeteries or cemeteries like that, where they don't have as much regulation, they choose just not to have those types of protections around because they don't care whether the ground is rolling. That's why actually if you look at a lot of historical cemeteries, they're like rolling pastures, and today they're all really flat. And that's because in the past they never used vaults and liners, and now it's almost the status quo at a cemetery. So, but going back to, where can we do this now? If you're not Quaker and if you don't belong to a religious organization, what we're starting to see pop up all around the U.S. are natural burial grounds or green cemeteries or even cemeteries that are hybrid, and so they've designated a portion of their cemetery to be exclusively natural, so that they don't allow embalmed bodies there, they don't allow non-organic containers, and they don't allow you to have a vault. So they maintain that if you want to be buried here, you can't have any of that. It's you, your shroud, and the ground. And a lot of the times they are preserved spaces, and so that at a later date it can't be taken over by a commercial cemetery or a land development organization. It just is to be maintained as a green space. And they happen to look more like green pastures and picnic grounds than they do cemeteries. But almost every state has a couple of these already, so it's just a matter of either going to the Green Burial Council's website and looking up the latest and greatest, or doing a quick Google search and saying green burial grounds or natural burial grounds around Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and getting a listing of those that will meet your criteria. And by the way, they will be at I'm Sorry to Hear shortly, so we will actually have them at our site so you could designate, I'm looking for a green burial ground. So those will be coming sometime this year. But
perfect. And while we're on that, I want to just take a minute so people understand if they're going to go to I'm Sorry to Hear what it is that you're conglomerating, that is vendors and information and consumer information basically about this industry. Can you just spend a couple minutes and tell us how you're managing the site?
Sure. So what we've done so far at I'm Sorry to Hear is we've started to collect all this really disparate information and education on funeral planning. And we've put it all in one spot, so everything that you would want to know, whether you want to learn about home funerals or green burials or traditional burials or cremation, can all be found in one place. There are lots of other great resources on this, but the problem is they're all out here on their own little island, and so unless you're looking specifically for it, you have to really hunt for it. You know what I mean? You're not just going to come upon it. So we're trying to create an atmosphere where we can almost dispel the truth about all these different topics so you can come and find everything here. So aside from having an amazing resource section that defines a lot of these things or talks about a lot of these topics, we also have a database of, well, it historically has been funeral homes, so that you can come and you can find a funeral home in Lansdale, Pennsylvania that is green burial friendly. Or I can find a funeral home in Queens that offers Jewish burials. And so we get really, really granular on like defining that funeral home and who they are, what they offer, and do they cater to a specific religion or culture, and also who are they owned by. So like, I'm sure a lot of you have heard that, oh, the funeral world is being taken over by these massive corporations.
Yeah, you have heard that they're buying up the smaller independent ones.
Yes. So just a quick side note on this. It's true, but still 80% of the industry is independently owned. It happens to be in some areas that there are these pockets of where almost everything is corporate, and then it's hard to find your independence. But what happens when a corporation like SCI, going to business as Dignity Memorial, or Stonemore, who completely hides the fact that they're Stonemore, or Carriage, or North Star, which are a little bit more proud about who they are and they kind of put it out there, is that they don't change the name of the funeral home. So when they buy them and they oust the owners, or now the owners are for hire as employees, they still keep John F. Smith and Family Funeral Home on the sign. And so you don't realize that the ownership has changed, their processes have changed, and their price lists have changed. And that, you know, Mr. John F. Smith is no longer the owner and funeral director, he's simply an employee, which doesn't necessarily give the most amount of flexibility for a consumer.
It becomes more standardized from a corporate perspective, and what's more beneficial there, not necessarily a consumer approach.
Yes, exactly. You absolutely lose flexibility when you work with a corporate-owned entity versus a family-owned, because the decision makers are no longer the decision makers. You know, you have to go up that corporate ladder to get approvals. And aside from the fact, it's been shown time and time again that the prices at corporate-owned funeral homes are generally 30% or more higher than independent. So whatever cost savings they're getting from streamlining their processes are not being passed on to the consumer.
Right.
So on our site, we talk about who they are. So we absolutely point out, who are they owned by? Are they corporately owned, and by who? And are they independent? Because I think that's an important piece of information as a consumer to have before you decide. So that's what we've historically had on I'm Sorry to Hear, but actually this is going to be kind of like my shameless plug at this point, that over the past couple of months, we actually changed our technology so that we can now not only list funeral homes for people to find and consult with and review, if you please. We can actually accept like 20 different types of vendors on our site, even more than that. So what that means is soon you'll be seeing cemeteries listed at our site. You're going to be able to find florists at our site. You're going to be able to find clergy or celebrants that are for hire on our site. You're going to be able to find musicians. So if you were looking for someone that had that wanted to come and perform either vocally or guitar or bagpipes or harp or whatever, you'll be able to find them on our site. So we've expanded our vendor marketplace to include a much wider set of professionals and services, so that, again, you can come to I'm Sorry to Hear and you can find out what is green burial, but you could also find a green burial provider, which is a funeral home, a cemetery, and a celebrant who celebrates nature. So it's going to be a very much more of a one-stop shop as we start to aggregate those vendors into one spot.
It's kind of the dream, the funeral dream, where you can get this one-stop solution, get a lot of information, and from there be able to figure out your options. I think it's This transparency to me is important. I think it's important for any industry that has been really shrouded, for lack of a better term, for so long. That is a good term, shrouded.
Got it.
And I would expect for the, it's kind of a tough thing for that independent. From what I hear, that's a really tough proposition to start up a funeral home in a community these days as an independent, because you may have someone who has been there for a long time, who's got market share, who's well known. So, what a tough spot for independents to be sometimes. They may be able to give better service, but, kind of like when a Home Depot or Sam's or something like that comes in, it changes things in the community. So thanks for aggregating that info.
Yeah, and also, a lot of the funeral homes have been owned by the same family or families for years and decades and decades. But what happens when the son or daughter of the owner doesn't want to go in the industry? So oftentimes those owners are faced with succession planning, which if it's not within their own family, they either need to bring in a new partner who is going to want to take over and buy into the funeral home, or sometimes the easier option is, when corporate comes knocking and says, hey, we'll give you several $1 million for your funeral home and you'll be set for the rest of your life. We'll give you the job for the next 10 years so you still can get a salary and then you have your retirement plan in place. That's a really attractive offer.
Yeah.
And can I blame them for selling? It's situational. I think that everyone has to make their own decisions. But, I could see why that would be a very attractive offer for someone who has been doing this forever and wants to see their life's work continue rather than just shut down. Yep. And having someone buy it rather than, like having to close the doors might be the best option for that person.
Sure. But then there's consequences of that as well. And speaking of that, you kind of touched on it a little bit. And what we really want to also kind of find out is, these costs, these hidden costs, these things that we think we need to do, that we bring our dead to the funeral home and we, find out, we get kind of told what has to be done versus being able to understand what it all means. So, we talked about these hidden costs or things we need to know about. Can you share with us those kinds of things? What do we need to know?
Yeah, so we could go a couple of different ways with this.
Okay. Take us where you think is the most beneficial for this audience and also, most interesting.
I'm going to touch on one, but then I think it's going to be too much to get really far into it. So maybe we'll do another segment, or you can get someone from the Home Funeral Alliance to come and be your guest.
That'd be cool.
So the first myth is that we have to use a funeral home, that we must use a funeral director and a funeral home to have a funeral. And while the very, very vast majority of the population will want to and will use a funeral home and a funeral director and their services, we actually don't have to. In 42 states, we are 100% allowed to care for our own dead and file our own paperwork and transport them either to the crematory or to the cemetery. We're allowed to do everything essentially that a funeral director does. Okay.
So we're allowed to transport the body. The reason I mention that is because this same funeral home who took care of my mom, and as I say, I got to know this woman who was a funeral director. I enjoyed her, and some of the crazy stories she told were that, and it sounded unreal to me, but when she had a family come up and say that they needed to do some planning and that they had their uncle with them in the car who had just died. Now, to us, that sounds as crazy as it is, but there she went out to the car, and there was this dead body waiting to be cared for, and they brought it along. Oh, so, and at the time, I didn't know what questions to ask. It was just more like, wow, that must have been quite a day,
Kind of unusual.
Exactly. And but I'm sure in that industry there are a lot of unusual things that we never even hear about. So, tell us the kinds of things that we're allowed to do that we don't think we can.
Well, I'll tell you though, like in terms of home funerals, where the states that have restrictions, it's with the actual transportation of the body. and it's the filing of death certificates, and it's having someone, a licensed funeral director, present at the final disposition. So those are kind of like the three things that hang it up, that you're either forced to use a funeral director because they're the only ones that are allowed to file a death certificate and get a burial transit permit or a cremation permit, or they're the only ones that are like legally allowed to move the body from here to there. Yeah. So that's kind of where we get hung up, and it's very much in like very old laws that everyone's forgotten about until you want to do some of these activities. But what you are allowed to do is, you know, if we die at home, which is a lot of people's wishes, everyone feels the need that, oh my God, I've got to call a funeral director right away. I have to get this dead body out of my house. Which, it's one thing to feel like creeped out by it, but it's a different thing to feel like you have to because it's illegal to have it there. So if someone does die at home because they were under hospice care, or it was like, you know, an unexpected death, usually the nurse or the hospice social worker that's involved will be able to make the appropriate calls and make sure that everything is situated. If not, you do have to call, not necessarily 911, but you'll need to call the physician and report the death just to make sure that you're all kosher about that. But there's nothing wrong with keeping your loved one at home for 24 or even 48 hours to say goodbye and to have that time to be with them and accept the fact that they're gone. Okay. There's nothing harmful about them. They're not going to decompose in front of you in 24 hours unless it's like 500 degrees heat. So the thing is, like, if it's summertime, you use logic. You say, okay, well, let's make sure the house is cool, or the room that they're in is going to be, you know, air conditioning's on. Let's make sure that, you know, if we need to get, you know, dry ice or gel packs, that we can do that to keep their core body temperature low, which slows decomposition. So those are things that the home funeral guides and the National Home Funeral Alliance can talk to you in depth about. But, you know, we can keep them at home, and if we want to have our friends and family over to say goodbye and have a viewing, we can have it at home at no cost.
Isn't that interesting?
And if you think about it, the funeral parlor, no one uses that word anymore. And actually, I've had some funeral directors really send me hate mail because I used that word on my site once.
Really?
So antiquated. We don't call it a parlor anymore. You know nothing. And I'm like, actually, in the South and the Midwest, they still call it a funeral parlor. Some cultures still call it a funeral parlor. But it's called a funeral parlor because when someone died, they used to die at home, and you used to lay them out in your parlor at home. And that was very, very, very commonplace. Now, of course, nowadays we don't do that very frequently, but we still can. So that's one myth. The other myth that I like to talk about is embalming. So there's been this long-standing myth that you have to be embalmed, and it's an unembalmed body is dangerous or hazardous to our health. And that's not true. So, I mean, like, never. Aside from very, very, very few circumstances is embalming ever required by law. So when embalming is typical is a funeral home does not want to lay out a body for viewing if it's not embalmed. That's their preference because they feel like it doesn't look good. So if you want to have a private family viewing before a closed casket funeral, you don't need to be embalmed. Or you need to find a funeral director that is okay with you having a public viewing with an unembalmed body, right?
Interesting, yeah. And the last couple funerals that I've gone to, you know, when it came to my assumption was that they were embalmed, but I don't know if makeup was not right or something, but they really did not look like themselves, and I wonder, and I don't know if this is the side of things you get really into, but within 24 to 48 hours, is that something that's kind of needed to help the body look, you know, comfortable for other people, or?
Well, I mean, maybe it's just it's our perception of what a dead person should look like has been skewed by media and film, right? We think dead people should look like live people. And that's what the embalming in cosmetology is supposed to mimic, is trying to make them look as alive as possible so that when you see them, you're not frightened that they look dead, but they're dead.
It's true, because the conversation usually after the fact is, you're there at the luncheon saying they look good or they didn't look good, or like what is a dead person supposed to? I mean, like looking good or not good? They're dead.
I mean, so let's be honest. Like gravity is going to take effect. So when you die and you're laying down in one place, your body's going to float. Your blood is going to float to the lowest place in your body.
Right.
So that's why you'll start to see discoloring. That's why you'll start to see, Misty, you're an expert on this stuff too. That's why you'll see like the change of their complexion. They're not going to be like rosy and like blood flowing through them, because blood isn't. They tend to get pale and the blood sinks to the bottom. So that's typical. And when you embalm, you actually remove all the blood and you replace it by chemicals, which helps them keep themselves like plush and supple and help them maintain that really full live format. And then you put makeup on them to give them the coloring back, because they lost the coloring because they have no blood in them. So
work. And by the way, gravity works while you're still alive too.
That's right. So well, back to the point though, embalming, this is not required. It's an invasive and also a very expensive procedure to have that helps temporarily preserve the body, and it may or may not make them look alive.
There you go.
It's arguable, because I know, like you said, some people are like, that doesn't look like.
That's not. Yeah, and I think sometimes that attempt, and a very well-intended attempt to make someone look really good has the kind of opposite effect, like, whoa,
I can tell you from personal experience, I'm half, well, I am Jewish. I consider myself to be Jewish, but half my family is not Jewish.
Okay.
I was raised Jewish. So depending on who dies in my family, mom's side or dad's side, we have very different like funeral protocol. But when my grandfather died, who was not on my Jewish side, he was like a classic Catholic Italian, we had an open casket for him. And he had been sick for a couple of years with prostate cancer before he died. So like we knew he was ill, and you could see physically the toll it was taking on him. But when he actually died and we had his funeral and he was embalmed and he was laid out to view, let me tell you, that was not the memory picture that I wanted of my grandfather. He looked nothing like himself. And I don't fault the funeral director, because, you never know how it's going to turn out, right? And it's a very difficult task to make someone dead look alive.
Yes.
But, for me, he was shaved. My grandfather, as far as I can remember, in like the 20-something years I was alive before he died, always had a beard. And he was always like kind of gruffy and a little bit grumpy, and he was very full. But instead, he was like this shaven man, and I didn't recognize his face, and his coloring was off, and the clothes that he was wearing was so not him. And for me, it was not a good memory, actually. I wish I hadn't seen him like that, because now I see that, and I wish I could just remember him as my grandfather who wears plaid and has this scruffy beard. It's like, come over here, And so it's not exactly what I wanted to envision for him.
Sure.
But that was culturally acceptable, That's what my family wanted.
Well, and that's also interesting. It kind of speaks to the question, which we won't get into now, but like not only how do we want to be cared for while we're, going through to the end of our lives and to death and dying, but how do we want it to be after the fact? And most of the time, I would think that is left to the family members and their sensibilities, not necessarily the person who died sensibilities.
And you know what? This is, I think, that something that's going to change, because we've all become way more about me. We've become a me society, and that's okay. My team and I today were actually helping build a My Funeral Wishes form, because we want to encourage people to say, this is what I want, this is what I don't want, this is how I visualize my funeral. And we're not even going to talk about advanced directives, which are like before the funeral. That's how I want to be cared for in my last days or weeks of my life if I can't talk for myself. But literally just my funeral, because it's so much easier if you spell it out for your loved ones that this is what I want and this is what I don't. Right? I'd be really upset if you embalmed me. Really, really upset. I do not like the process. I do not want those chemicals in me, and I don't want those chemicals subsequently going in the ground. But if I don't tell my family that, if I don't express that to them verbally, if I don't write that down and share it with them, then how are they going to know that? They're just going to do what they think that I'd want, or maybe what they want, and it's not what I need. So, having a discussion about how you see your death, I think, is really important if you want those wishes followed through on.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Really important. Yeah. And sometimes, sometimes people go the other way and they say, it doesn't matter, I'm dead. Let the family do what works for them. And other people like to plan more. Like they like to say, no, I know my family's going to be crazy with worry or with emotion or with, I know they're not going to be able to handle it. So those are the people that take the steps and they plan, and then they can make it a lot easier for their families if they take the time and plan it out. And some people do have the time to take, and we're kind of encouraging that on our whole Death Chick show, is to talk about it and plan for it, because it really does make things so much easier for the people that you're leaving behind once you take these steps. And we even think that you should make it fun, like plan a little bit of, have some fun things in your will, have some kickers, or invite your favorite band from whatever year, or do something fun and play it up a bit. So so thanks, Rachel. There's one thing that we were talking about, and I don't know about this too much, but it's the final expense insurance to fund burials. And would you like to talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's something that's pushed, but it may not be a good thing.
Yeah. So let's talk about, how do you pay for a funeral? Let's start there, and we can talk about final expense insurance. So typically how you pay for a funeral is in cash or a credit card or from a life insurance policy that someone held. So it's very common for people to have life insurance policies, especially if they work in a corporate setting. Sometimes it's offered as a benefit, to that employee. And oftentimes life insurance policies will cover funeral or final expenses, as they call it. They steer away from funeral, but final expenses. So you can, before you go ahead and pay in cash or, go into debt over a funeral, let's check to see whether your life insurance policy covers final expenses, including funeral home services and cemetery services and products. Now, if you don't, and some people don't have life insurance, they don't want life insurance, or they can't afford life insurance, there is something that's called final expense insurance, which is something that, as an advocate with the Funeral Consumers Alliance, I've been told time and time again, is a bad deal. So think about all the insurance that you have in your life. Automobile insurance, homeowner insurance, health insurance. They're for what ifs.
That's true.
People get them expecting not to use them. But in case you have to, you get in a car accident, you have a flood, you need to go to the hospital, you're covered. It's an if, and insurance is an if. Like, that's how insurance companies charge premiums, is that they're weighing the risks of this event happening. And based on that, you pay more or less, right? And how many people love their car insurance, or love their health insurance, or love their homeowner's insurance, right? Something always happens that when you need to file a claim, there's all these hidden fees or exceptions. Well, we don't cover this, or we don't cover that, right? And this fine print, which you weren't able to see because it's like this, or you misunderstood because it's in jargon that you don't understand, all of a sudden surfaces it, and you realize that I'm actually not fully covered. So take your experience with insurance in other parts of your life, and then replicate that for a funeral. So you think all of your funeral expenses are covered, right? They're not. There's some things that are going to be exceptions that they won't cover. Not to mention that with funerals, it's not an if question. It's a when. We're all going to die. So how do you price an insurance policy when you know everybody's going to use it?
That's a good point, because it's about it's about managing risk. So the only thing here I could see is it's like only like a when, not an if.
Yeah. So it's like a risk of, does this person continue to pay this until they die, or will they just pay us for a few years and then drop the policy, and then we have all their money and they never used it? And so logically, it doesn't make sense because insurance is based on risks of something happening, and we're all going to die. So
that is hilarious. That's great. You know, that's something that's so simple, but you wouldn't really think about it. You think, oh yeah, final expense insurance. I should get that. But thank you. That's great. I love it. I love it. So stupid, simple, but yeah.
Logical. And you know, these are not my ideas. I have been well educated by like the best of the best. Like Josh Slocum can talk your ear off on this topic in such a funny way. If he's not a guest, you should line him up of the Funeral Consumers Alliance National. But so like that's the first thing with final expense insurance. And then aside from that, we hear time and time again that there is just so much fine print, and no one understands these contracts, that you know, you either end up paying way more into that policy than what the policy is worth. So say you got a $10,000 policy, and by the time you put in your claim, you've paid $14,000 into it. They're not going to give you that $4,000 back. That's their profit on the deal, right? Or you know,
interesting too. Does it target lower income people primarily, or is it across the board?
I don't know for sure. I think that they do tend to try to sell this to lower income and senior citizens that naturally have lower incomes, as almost like a scare tactic. And they say it's going to cover everything, but inevitably it's not going to cover everything. You know, if you get the policy today, there might be a clause in there that says that if you die within 24 months of starting this policy, then you get nothing. And so what happens if you have an accidental death in 6 months and you've already paid several hundred or thousands of dollars into this? They're going to be like, sorry, it's gone, right? So what we always advise is that it's very prudent to plan ahead, but it's not very prudent to pay ahead. So if you want to make sure that you have the funds to cover the cost of the funeral that you want, why don't you just set up a payable upon death bank account, and you, instead of every month giving $100 to this insurance company, you put $100 into that bank account, okay? And then that adds up year over year over year. You have a co-signer on that bank account that when you die has the right to access those funds immediately.
Good advice.
Okay, that means that that money never leaves really your hands or your estate, and if your funeral ends up costing less than what you put in there, it goes back to your family. It ends up costing more, at least they know what's in there, and they know how to close that gap, or they know how to cut down on the cost of the funeral to meet with what you have. But that's like the safest option. And you know, you'll earn nominal interest. It's not so much about the interest, it's more about you just planning ahead and putting money aside like you would for retirement or for education.
And you have that debited out of your account just like it would be taken if, you know, you had to pay a premium. So, I mean, there's ways to do it that way too, because most people who, you know, when you say, sure, I should put that aside, you don't, but you could set it up so that you did.
Absolutely. There's lots of ways you can get smart with this. And the other thing on this topic is the prepaid, like basically prepaying a funeral at a funeral home. And now I'm going to give you a very different opinion than the funeral director who's going to give you a sales pitch on it. So the problem with prepaying a funeral at a funeral home is that, yes, prices do change over time, so you might be able to lock in today's prices for tomorrow. But what happens if that funeral director no longer owns that funeral home? What happens if a corporate buys out that funeral home? What happens if that funeral home goes out of business? What happens if you move across the country and you no longer want to be buried or use that funeral home that you chose, right? So your money is semi-locked into this funeral home. And in theory, you should be able to move it, but it ends up being a way more complicated process than you or your family would want it to be. Aside from that, every state has different laws on the way that those funds need to be invested. Mm-hmm. Some states are more secure than others. Some of them say, you must, funeral director, put this in a state-held trust that you cannot touch. This is the consumer's money. But other ones require them to put it into an insurance policy or some sort of fluctuating instrument, so that it may or may not be worth more than it is. And some of them have different vesting rules. Like, okay, they have to put away 80% of what you give them, not 100%. So every state is different, and you have to be really, really careful with knowing these laws before you put money in there. But aside from the fact, it's more about the convenience of being able to take it elsewhere if you want to.
Right. And you wouldn't. Most people who aren't looking into funerals until they need them aren't going to look into the rules and the laws that would protect them should they choose to. It's kind of hard to get people to do that. But the suggestions you make are just really smart.
Yeah, and also if you think about it, it's like, again, if you have a prepaid funeral at a funeral home that's been put in a trust and it's nice and protected, there are still inevitably some expenses that are not going to be covered by that. And a lot of those are those cash advance items that the funeral director simply helps facilitate, but they don't actually really get money from that. They just kind of give it. So that's the cost of placing an obituary, which you don't have to do, by the way. You don't have to place an obituary, and an obituary is something you pay for. It's an advertisement in a newspaper's eyes. And so it can be very costly depending on where you live. You could spend hundreds of dollars placing an obituary, which purpose is to let people know that this person's died and where to pay their respects. But today, if you want a less costly way, again, I'm not saying don't place an obituary, but there are options. There's social media. There's email. You could call people. You could put it on Facebook. We see it all the time for free. Or sometimes funeral homes have obituaries on their site, and they could place that whole obituary there for free, and then they can give you a link to send out through social media and whatever. So if you need a way to cut costs, an obituary in a newspaper is not going to be your friend. It's going to be very costly. But again, that's a cash advance. And if you have clergy preside over your funeral, that's going to be a cash advance. All the cemetery costs are going to be separate from your funeral costs. So you have to see whether that's included in what's allowed in the trust and what's not. The opening and closing of the grave, that's an added cost. So even if, what I'm getting at is, even if you feel like you've prepaid for your whole funeral and everything's covered, family, it's not. There are going to be expenses that are not covered, and they're going to be a surprise for your loved ones. So don't fool yourselves into thinking that it's all taken care of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Rachel, we're coming back to the top of the hour. Another question we wanted to touch on was veterans benefits, and we have a guest coming on who's going to be talking about loss, like war loss and combat loss, and I'm wondering if possibly during that show you may be able to join us and pop in for a short bit to talk about that. If not, maybe it's something that you could answer on our comment stream, but I know that was something we were hoping to touch on, but we just won't have time. But before we go, let's just please state your website and how people can find you and how you can help them. So whatever you have going on, and then Patty and I will share too before we end off the show. And thank you so much. Just as last time you were with us, there's just so much information that we have no idea, because most of us, we put our blinders on to death, and Patty and I are about taking those blinders off and having a good look at it, and you really pulled back the curtains. So thank you.
Well, you guys are awesome for bringing light to this topic and making it a weekly conversation and having really interesting guests, myself included, on the show to talk about this in a way, just bringing everything to the surface. So you guys are awesome. Keep doing what you're doing. With regards to veterans, sure, I'm happy to kind of pop in, but if you guys need information real quick, go to I'mSorryToHear.com, go to our article section and just search veterans benefits, and we list out all those benefits there. So in a nutshell, if you're looking for pretty much anything on the topic of funerals, funeral planning, cremation, burial, how to find a funeral home, looking for a specific type of funeral home, or green burial information, come to I'm Sorry to Hear. We have tons and tons of resources that we've tried to organize in a very obvious way for you to access. And if not, we have a blog. You can write to us. You can email us, and we're happy to answer all your questions. I also am a board member of the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Greater Philadelphia, It's a wonderful nonprofit that operates with chapters all across the country. We are your local feet on the street advocates that know state law, we know the funeral landscape, great resources. So I also want to put a plug in for that because you know, they're just a great group of people, and it's something that we all volunteer our time to do, so we can help people in our community better navigate this with some one-on-one support. So thank you guys so much for having me and letting me chew your ear off for an hour. And I can't wait to join you guys on your future calls.
Sounds great. You know, it's so hard to wrap my head around how riveted I am when you talk about funerals. I'm just like, really? It's so hard for me to believe in it. Even though I'm in the death space, I'm in it at it feels like at a different space, and every time we have you on, I feel like this whole new world gets opened up. So thank you so much for that. Just going around sharing with you what's happening. I'm Patty Burgess with DoingDeathDifferently.com, and what we do is training for people who are drawn to end-of-life care, to be with their loved ones who are dying as a caregiver. Maybe you're a mental health professional, simply just exploring and maybe looking at your own limitations and fears about what might block you from serving someone who is at the end of life. That's what my training program is all about. So you can check that out at the training tab when you get there. And I also wanted to show, with a little bit of whimsy, kind of what maybe Rachel will even be creating on her website, and maybe you can get something like it. But I found this in a store. It's called I'm Dead, Now What?
Awesome.
With the little toe tag on there. And basically what it is a planner. It's talking about important information about my belongings. It's put out by Peter Pauper Press. I don't know where else to get it, but I just love the fact that, kind of along with our sensibility, like, let's get real. And here we are. I'm dead, now what? This is all the things that you probably need to know or tell other people and loved ones about. And I heard you briefly, Rachel, mention that you're putting together kind of a wish list for a funeral. So, you know, maybe some of that we'll be able to get at your site as well as things go on and progress for you. So thanks again. I'm Patty Burgess, Doing Death Differently, and my amazing co-host up there in the Arctic, where she has now been thawed out for after all those years. And look at her. She doesn't look cold. She looks nice and warm.
That's right. Well, my daughter was frolicking in the waves the other day. It's starting to warm up, and there's probably going to be some beach days coming up. Wow. So we have June, July, August. June's our spring, July's our summer, and August the leaves start changing again. But we're doing great up here. And I wanted to say regarding the Funeral Consumer Alliance, thank you, Rachel, for that tip. And that fellow you mentioned, I think I saw Patty, you were writing down his name, so hopefully we'll bring him on. I'm Misty Lynn. I'm from bittersweetblessing.com. My whole take on things and how I coach mostly women is to connect with their deep sense of inner wellness after losing a loved one. So if I have an event planned later this summer, it's Overcoming Fear, and right now you can go to my website, bittersweetblessing.com, go to live events, you can download the free Overcoming Fear mini course, and then I'm going to be walking whoever wants to through that live later on, so stay tuned. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining the Death Checks. Please keep following us and share around. We're growing, we're getting bigger, and we're changing the world one person at a time. So take the steps and have fun with funeral planning, everyone. We'll see you next week.
And do not die without a plan, and do not die without finding out more from I'm Sorry to Hear, because you need to know. All right?
Okay.
Take care, everybody.
All right.
Bye.